My name is Claire Bennett, and I was 30 years old when my parents chose my younger brother's luxury restaurant launch in Singapore over my wedding in Napa Valley, California. My mother delivered the news on a quiet Tuesday afternoon while I was arranging centerpieces in my future mother-in-law's dining room. She sounded almost cheerful, as if she were confirming lunch plans instead of telling her daughter she wouldn't be attending the biggest day of her life. "We've talked it over," she said. "Your father and I really need to be with Ethan that weekend." I remember staring at the eucalyptus leaves in my hands. "What about my wedding?" There was a pause. "Oh, sweetheart, you'll have Mason's family there. You'll be surrounded by people who love you." Then she added the sentence I had heard my entire life. "You've always been so understanding." She hung up before I found the right words. What she didn't know was that a documentary filmmaker had already been following our wedding preparations for months. She didn't know every empty seat, every quiet moment, every smile hiding disappointment would end up preserved forever on camera. She definitely didn't know that millions of strangers would eventually watch the story unfold and recognize exactly what had happened without anyone needing to explain it. But before any of that happened, there was a lifetime of being second. I met Linda Harper 5 years earlier. Except she wasn't my mother. She was Mason's. Linda was 61 years old, taught elementary school for nearly 3 decades, and somehow managed to make every person who walked into her home feel like they'd been expected all along. The first time Mason invited me over for dinner, I arrived 20 minutes early because I was terrified of making a bad impression. I stood outside with a bottle of red wine in one hand and a bouquet of wildflowers in the other, rehearsing introductions that sounded less awkward in my head than they ever would out loud. Linda opened the front door before I even knocked. "You must be Claire." She smiled like we'd known each other forever. "I've been hoping you'd come." "Not nice to meet you." "Not come on in." "I've been hoping you'd come." It was such a simple sentence. It also broke something inside me. Because nobody in my own family had ever made me feel expected. Growing up, everything revolved around Ethan. When he wanted to play soccer, weekends became soccer weekends. When he switched to surfing, every family vacation suddenly needed to be near the ocean. When he decided music was his future, my parents transformed our garage into a recording studio. When I won first place in my high school's statewide engineering competition, my father congratulated me from the parking lot because Ethan had forgotten his guitar before a local concert. "I'll make it up to you," Dad said. He never did. When I graduated from UC Berkeley, my parents missed the ceremony because Ethan had an audition in Lowe's Angels. Mom texted me afterward. "We're so proud of you. Dinner next week." Next week never came. When I bought my first home at 28, they promised to help me paint. That Saturday, Ethan called because he wanted company while shopping for furniture. Guess who got the help? Guess who painted an entire house alone? People often asked why I never confronted them. The truth. I did. Just never loudly. Every birthday. Every holiday. Every canceled dinner. Every forgotten milestone. I'd ask the same question. Why? And every answer sounded different while meaning exactly the same thing. Ethan needs us. This is important for him. You understand? Eventually, those words stopped sounding like reassurance. They started sounding like permission. Permission to disappoint me because I'd never make a scene. Permission to assume I'd recover. Permission to believe I would always wait. My Aunt Grace noticed it long before I did. She was my mother's older sister and the only person in our family willing to disagree with her out loud. One Thanksgiving, while washing dishes together, she handed me a towel and quietly said, "Your parents mistake independence for invincibility." I laughed. She didn't. They think because you survive disappointment, it doesn't hurt. I never forgot that sentence. Not because it comforted me, because it explained 30 years of my life. A month before the wedding, I slipped a handwritten letter into the invitation envelope addressed to my parents. Not an angry letter. Not an ultimatum. Just honesty. I wrote, "Mom, Dad, I know life gets busy, and I know Ethan's dreams matter. Mine do too. Please don't miss this day. I'm not asking for gifts or speeches. I just want to look up while walking down the aisle and see my parents smiling back at me. Love, Claire." I asked Aunt Grace to deliver it personally. She drove nearly an hour to my parents' house. Mom thanked her, placed the envelope on the kitchen island, started talking about travel plans for Singapore. Grace watched the entire conversation. The envelope stayed unopened. She told herself Mom would read it later. So did I. 2 weeks afterward, Grace stopped by again to borrow a baking dish. The envelope hadn't moved. Still sealed. Still sitting exactly where she'd left it, between a stack of unopened mail and a catalog advertising luxury patio furniture. My mother never even opened it. I didn't answer my father's letter. Not because I wanted to punish him. Because, for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't owe anyone an immediate response, simply because they finally decided to listen. For years, every difficult conversation in my family had ended the same way. Someone disappointed me. Someone explained why. Then everyone expected me to make them feel better. I wasn't doing that anymore. About 6 weeks later, on a cool Saturday morning in October, someone knocked on our front door. I was outside, trimming lavender bushes along the walkway, when I saw a silver SUV pull into the driveway. Before the driver's door even opened, I knew. Mom. She stepped out slowly. She looked thinner than I remembered. Not dramatically. Just tired. She'd always been perfectly put together. Perfect hair. Perfect makeup. Perfect smile. Today her hair was tied back in a simple ponytail. No jewelry except her wedding ring. No carefully rehearsed confidence. She stood beside the car for several seconds before walking toward me. "I wasn't sure you'd answer my calls." "I wasn't. I know." We stood there in silence. Neither of us moved. Finally she spoke. "I watched the documentary." "I know. I've watched it 7 times." I said nothing. "The first 6 times," she admitted, "I kept looking for proof that people misunderstood us." She swallowed. "The 7th time, I realized they understood us perfectly." For a long moment, she simply looked at the garden. Then she quietly asked, "Can we talk?" I glanced toward the house. Mason was inside. He'd seen her car arrive, but hadn't come outside. He knew this conversation belonged to me. I nodded toward 2 chairs on the porch. We sat down. The same distance apart strangers usually leave between themselves. Mom folded her hands together. "I've been trying to figure out when all this started." I waited. I used to tell myself Ethan needed more attention because he struggled more. She laughed bitterly. Then years passed, and I never stopped. Her eyes filled with tears. "I convinced myself you didn't need me because you never demanded anything." I looked at her calmly. "I did." She blinked. "I just stopped asking out loud." She lowered her head. "I know." She reached into her purse. "I brought something." She handed me a cream-colored envelope. I recognized it instantly. It was the wedding invitation. The same one Aunt Grace had delivered. The same one that had sat unopened on the kitchen island. Now, it had been carefully opened along the edge. Inside was my handwritten note. The paper had softened slightly from being unfolded so many times. I finally read it. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I read it after the documentary. She looked at me. I realized the saddest part wasn't that I missed your wedding. She took a shaky breath. It was that I never even cared enough to read how much it mattered to you. Neither of us spoke. The silence felt different this time. Not defensive. Not angry. Honest. I started seeing a therapist. She said it quietly. Twice a week. I should have done it years ago. She looked directly at me. I'm not telling you this so you'll forgive me. I'm telling you because, for the first time, I want to become someone who deserves the chance. I believed she meant it. But believing someone has changed isn't the same as trusting them again. Those are different journeys. What do you want from me? She finally asked. The question surprised me. Not because she'd asked it. Because she'd never asked before. I thought carefully. Then answered. I don't need you to fix the past. You can't. I need you to stop pretending it wasn't real. A tear rolled down her cheek. I won't. And I need you to understand. I looked toward the vineyard in the distance. That rebuilding something takes longer than breaking it. She nodded immediately. I know. No. I smiled gently. I don't think you do yet. But maybe someday you will. She accepted that answer without arguing. That alone felt like the biggest change I'd ever seen in her. The attention surrounding the documentary slowly became impossible to ignore. Neighbors who had never spoken to me before smiled when they passed our house. Complete strangers sent handwritten letters describing birthdays, graduations, weddings, and funerals, where they had also discovered what it felt like to be the child who was expected to understand. I read many of them, not because I needed validation, because every letter reminded me that disappointment has a way of making people believe they're alone. Most of them aren't. They've just never met anyone willing to say it out loud. About 3 weeks after the documentary reached 14 million views, a plain white envelope arrived in our mailbox. No return address. I recognized my father's handwriting immediately. Every letter was printed in neat block capitals, exactly the way he'd written birthday cards when I was little. I carried the envelope inside and placed it on the kitchen table. I stared at it for almost an hour before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Nothing fancy. No dramatic opening. Just honesty. Claire, I've rewritten this letter more times than I can count. Every version sounded like an excuse. I don't want to make excuses anymore. When I watched the documentary, I kept waiting for someone to explain why your mother and I weren't there. No one ever did. The camera never judged us. It didn't need to. It simply showed 2 empty chairs. For 30 years, I convinced myself I was keeping peace in our family by agreeing with whatever was easiest. The truth is, I was protecting myself from difficult conversations. Every time your mother said Ethan needed us more, I stayed quiet. Every time you accepted another disappointment, I told myself you were strong enough to handle it. Strength became the excuse we used to abandon you. Watching Robert take your arm down that aisle forced me to see something I should have understood years ago. He wasn't replacing me. He was doing the job I kept choosing not to do. I don't expect one letter to repair 30 years. It can't. But I wanted, for once in my life, to tell you the truth without asking you to make me feel better afterward. I'm sorry. Not only for Singapore. For every birthday. Every graduation. Every promise. Every moment that taught you not to expect me. I hope someday I become someone worth knowing again. Love. Dad. I finished reading. folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, then sat there for several minutes. When Mason came home, I handed it to him without saying anything. He read every word. When he finished, he quietly placed it back on the table. "What are you thinking?" he asked. I looked toward the window. "I think this is the first time my dad has written to me instead of writing to his own guilt." Mason nodded. "Are you going to answer?" I shook my head. "Not yet. There are apologies that deserve immediate forgiveness. And there are apologies that simply deserve time. This one belonged to the second kind. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel responsible for deciding how quickly someone else could heal. I had spent decades carrying that burden. I finally set it down. Over the next few days, the documentary kept spreading in ways none of us could have predicted. A wedding photographer in Oregon shared it with the caption, "This is why documenting real moments matters more than perfect poses." A family counselor used a 30-second clip during a seminar about emotional neglect. Someone translated the subtitles into Spanish, then Portuguese, then Japanese. The story was traveling farther than we ever imagined. Not because it was sensational, because it was familiar. 10 days after the upload, Adrian called me. "You should probably know." "What?" "The documentary passed 10 million views this morning." I nearly dropped my coffee. 10 million. I've refreshed the page 3 times. I still don't believe it. Neither did I. We had never wanted attention. We had simply wanted to remember our wedding. Instead, our wedding had become part of thousands of conversations happening all over the world. That afternoon, Aunt Grace stopped by carrying fresh banana bread. She placed it on the kitchen counter before saying a single word. "They've seen it." I figured. "No." She shook her head slowly. "I mean, they've really seen it." She explained that my parents had watched the documentary together the night before. All 26 minutes. Without saying much. Mom cried during Robert's speech. Dad barely moved the entire time. When the film ended, they immediately watched it again. Not because they wanted to admire the wedding. Because they couldn't stop staring at the empty chairs. "They kept rewinding that part," Grace said quietly. "They were trying to convince themselves it wasn't as bad as it looked." She looked at me. It looked exactly as bad as it was. The next voicemail arrived that evening. This time it was my father. His voice sounded different. Older somehow. "Claire." He paused for several seconds. "I watched the film. I didn't realize." Another silence. "No." He corrected himself. "I realized. I just spent years pretending I didn't." His breathing became uneven. "When Robert walked you down the aisle, I understood what I'd given away. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry." The message ended there. No excuses. No mention of Singapore. No complaints about the internet. Just 7 words. "I'm sorry." I listened to it twice, then turned my phone over without replying. That night, Mason found me sitting on the porch. "You okay?" "I don't know." He sat beside me. "Did your dad call?" I nodded. "What did he say?" I stared out across the dark vineyard beyond our backyard. For the first time, he apologized without explaining himself. Mason stayed quiet. After a while he asked, "Does that change anything?" I thought about it. Longer than I expected. Finally I answered. "It changes him." I looked down at my wedding ring. "But I don't know if it changes us." The following morning, the documentary crossed 14 million views. Adrian texted only 2 words. 14 million. Neither of us replied for several minutes. There wasn't really anything to say. Some stories belong to one family. Others somehow end up belonging to everyone who has ever felt unseen. Ours had quietly become the second kind. By the end of the second day, the documentary had crossed 100,000 views. That was unusual for Adrian's channel. By the fourth day, it passed 500,000. Neither of us understood why at first. Then Olivia called. "Claire, you need to look at the comments. I've been trying not to." "No." Her voice cracked slightly. "You need to read these." That evening, Mason and I sat together on the couch and opened the comment section for the first time. The top comment had over 12,000 likes. Those two empty chairs told an entire life story without anyone saying a single word. Another read. The way her father-in-law held her hand before they passed those seats completely broke me. Then another. My parents skipped my nursing school graduation because my brother had a football tournament. I thought I was the only one this happened to. Another. I started crying the moment I realized nobody ever explained where her parents were. The camera didn't have to. Hundreds became thousands. Thousands became tens of thousands. People weren't just talking about our wedding. They were telling their own stories. A woman wrote that her parents had missed the birth of her first child because her younger sister needed help moving apartments. A man admitted his family had attended his cousin's destination, wedding, instead of his military homecoming. Someone wrote, "I spent 20 years believing I wasn't important enough. Watching this made me realize I wasn't imagining it." I didn't know any of these people. Yet somehow, they understood exactly what those empty chairs meant. 5 days after the upload, a California parenting blogger shared the documentary. Her article carried a simple headline: "The quiet wedding film everyone is talking about." She never criticized my parents. She never speculated. She simply described the moment when the camera lingered on two empty reserved seats. The article spread quickly. By that weekend, the documentary had reached over 2 million views. The emails started arriving next. Morning television producers, podcast hosts, magazine editors, family therapists asking whether they could reference the documentary in workshops. Adrian forwarded every request to us. I declined every single one. Mason asked why. I smiled. The documentary already says everything I wanted to say. There was nothing left to explain. A week later, the internet figured out who Ethan was. Not because Adrian mentioned him. He never did. But someone recognized my parents from photos Ethan had posted during the Singapore restaurant opening. The timelines matched. The faces matched. The comments underneath Ethan's social media changed almost overnight. Were your parents at your sister's wedding? Is this the same family from that documentary? Please tell me this isn't true. Ethan stopped posting. My parents disappeared from social media completely. The documentary never mentioned their names. It didn't have to. Reality had already connected the pieces. 3 days later, my phone rang. Mom. For the first time since the wedding. I stared at the screen until it stopped. Then another call. Dad. Then Mom again. Then another. 5 missed calls in less than an hour. Finally, a voicemail appeared. I waited until evening before listening. Claire. Mom's voice sounded strained. I don't understand why that filmmaker focused on those chairs. She paused. People are saying terrible things about us. Another pause. You need to ask him to remove the video. Not. I'm sorry. Not. I wish we'd been there. Not. I've watched it and finally understand how much we hurt you. Only. People are talking. I listened to the message twice, then quietly deleted it. Not because I wanted to erase it, because I finally understood something. She wasn't grieving the decision. She was grieving that other people had seen it. 2 weeks after the wedding, Adrian emailed us a private link. Subject, rough cut moments that matter, Claire and Mason. The documentary was 26 minutes long. I waited until Mason left for work before pressing play. The opening was exactly what I expected. Morning, light over the vineyards. Linda laughing while buttoning my dress. Robert nervously practicing his tie in the hallway when he thought nobody was watching. Olivia fixing my veil. Grace setting pastries on the kitchen counter. It wasn't flashy. It felt honest. Adrian had a gift for finding the small moments most people overlooked. Halfway through the film came Robert's toast. Watching it from the outside somehow made it even more emotional than hearing it in person. Then came our vows. The first dance. Guests laughing. Children chasing bubbles across the lawn. I smiled through most of it. Until the music disappeared. No narration. No interviews. No dramatic editing. Just silence. The camera slowly panned across the front row. 2 white chairs. Ivory reservation cards. Completely empty. It held that shot for several seconds. Long enough for the absence to become impossible to ignore. Then the camera cut back to me, walking down the aisle beside Robert. Nothing else needed to be explained. The story was already there. When the documentary ended, I sat in complete silence. Not because I was embarrassed. Because Adrian hadn't tried to make villains out of anyone. He simply showed the truth. The truth didn't need dramatic music. It didn't need angry interviews. It only needed 2 empty chairs. That evening, Mason came home and found me sitting on the patio with my laptop still open. "You watched it?" I nodded. "What do you think?" "It's beautiful." He smiled. I thought so too. I hesitated. Adrian asked whether we were comfortable with him publishing it. Mason pulled out the chair beside me. "What do you want?" I looked back toward the paused image on my screen. The empty seats. Robert holding my arm. The sunlight across the aisle. "I don't want to hide anymore." He reached across the table and took my hand. "Then don't." I called Adrian that night. "If you still want to upload it." "I do." He paused. "Are you sure?" "Once it's online," he said, "people will make assumptions. They'll ask questions. They'll tell their own stories." "I know." "You don't want me to cut the empty chair scene." I answered immediately. "No. That happened. I'm not ashamed of what happened." There was a long silence. Finally, Adrian said, "Okay. I'll post it Friday morning." Friday arrived. Neither Mason nor I watched the upload go live. We went hiking instead. No phones. No notifications. No refreshing view counts. By the time we returned that afternoon, Adrian had already texted. 12,000 views. Great comments so far. Nothing unusual. His documentaries regularly reached that audience. The comments were exactly what you'd expect. Beautiful couple. Robert seems like an incredible father-in-law. The vineyard is gorgeous. Then, sometime that evening, someone noticed the chairs. One comment simply asked, "Who were those 2 reserved seats for?" Another person replied, "I think they belong to the bride's parents." Someone else wrote, "Wait, where are her parents?" Adrian never answered. He never explained anything his camera had already shown. He believed audiences were smart enough to connect the dots themselves. Within 48 hours, thousands of people had. And none of us had any idea that our quiet little wedding film was about to become something far bigger than a memory. It was about to become a conversation. The reception began just as the sun slipped behind the rolling hills. Strings of cafe lights flickered to life above the dance floor, casting a warm glow across long farmhouse tables covered with white linen, eucalyptus garlands, and hundreds of tiny candles. Guests wandered between conversations with glasses of local wine. Children chased each other across the lawn. Someone had already convinced Robert to dance before dinner, despite his insistence that he didn't dance anymore. Linda laughed so hard she nearly spilled her drink. Watching them, I realized something. Joy doesn't erase heartbreak. It simply reminds you that heartbreak isn't the whole story. Dinner had barely finished when Robert stood up, gently tapping his glass with a spoon. The room slowly quieted. "I've spoken in front of crowds before," he began. "As a firefighter, you give speeches at retirements, memorials, award ceremonies." He smiled. "But none of those prepared me for tonight." He looked toward me. The first time Claire came to our house, she stood in our entryway holding a bottle of wine with both hands. Several people laughed softly. I remember thinking she looked like someone waiting for permission. He paused. It broke my heart. I didn't know her story then. I only knew that nobody should ever walk into a home wondering whether they're welcome. Robert looked around the room. So I decided something that day. If she kept coming, I'd make sure she never had to wonder again. Silence settled over the reception. I've learned something over the last 5 years. Family isn't the people who ask whether you're available. It's the people who rearrange their lives because you matter. He turned toward Mason. "You chose well." Then toward me again. "And Claire." His voice softened. "I hope one day, years from now, when you think back on today, the first thing you remember won't be the people who were missing. I hope you remember all the people who refused to be." I was crying before he finished. So was Linda. So was Aunt Grace. Even Adrian lowered his camera for a moment. Not because he'd stopped filming. Because sometimes even the person documenting a story needs a second to feel it. The rest of the evening unfolded exactly the way weddings should. There was terrible dancing. Too much cake. A flower girl who refused to go home because she wanted just one more song. Mason's college friends convinced Robert to join them for a group photo. Someone accidentally knocked over the dessert table. Linda declared it part of the memories. Nobody cared. Every imperfect moment somehow made the day feel even more complete. Around 10 o'clock, Adrian quietly approached us. "I've got enough footage." Mason smiled. "Already?" He nodded. "I think I have everything." "What kind of story do you think it'll become?" I asked. He looked toward the dance floor, where Robert was teaching 2 little boys how to swing dance. "I honestly don't know yet." He smiled. "But I have a feeling. The answer isn't going to be in the speeches." He glanced briefly toward the ceremony site, now empty beneath the string lights. "I think it's going to be in those chairs." I followed his gaze. Even from a distance, I could still see them. 2 empty seats, waiting for people who had never intended to fill them. The cameras stopped rolling just before midnight. Guests hugged goodbye. Cars disappeared down the vineyard road one by one. Eventually, only immediate family remained. Or at least, the family who had chosen to become one. Linda insisted we all eat leftover pie in the kitchen before leaving. Robert was still wearing his navy tie. He refused to take it off. "I've never owned a more important tie," he joked. Everyone laughed. But I knew he meant it. As Mason and I finally climbed into the car to leave, I looked back one last time. The vineyard was quiet again. The chairs had already been stacked away. The flowers would be gone by morning. But something had changed. Not because my parents had stayed away. Because, for the first time in my life, their absence hadn't defined the day. The people who showed up had. The string quartet began playing just as the vineyard doors opened. Soft violin, gentle cello, nothing dramatic. Just enough music to slow the heartbeat. Robert and I stood together for one final second before stepping outside. He quietly whispered, "You don't have to be brave today." I looked at him. What if I don't know how not to be? He smiled. Then borrow some of mine. The wedding coordinator nodded. The doors opened. Sunlight flooded the stone walkway. 130 guests rose to their feet. The sound wasn't applause. It was something quieter. The rustle of dresses, suit jackets, people turning all at once. For a brief moment, everything became still. Robert gently squeezed my hand. Together, we took the first step. The vineyard looked exactly the way we'd imagined it months earlier. Rows of white chairs lined either side of the aisle. Wildflowers framed the wooden arbor where Mason waited. The hills behind him glowed beneath the late afternoon sun. It was perfect. Almost. Halfway down the aisle, my eyes drifted toward the left side of the front row. 2 white chairs. Simple wooden frames. Each with a small ivory card tied to the back. Reserved. Empty. Completely untouched. No jackets. No purses. No forgotten programs. Just 2 silent reminders of people who had chosen to be somewhere else. For a split second, the world around me disappeared. The music faded. The guests blurred. All I could see were those chairs. 30 years. Countless birthdays. Missed graduations. Canceled dinners. Promises postponed. Every disappointment somehow fit inside those 2 empty seats. Robert felt my pace slow. Without looking at the chairs, he quietly placed his hand over mine. Not pulling. Not pushing. Just reminding me. I wasn't walking alone anymore. I looked forward again. Toward Mason. Toward the people who had shown up. And we kept walking. Several guests later told me they noticed the empty chairs immediately. Some knew the story. Most didn't. They didn't need to. Absence has a language everyone understands. Adrian's camera slowly followed us down the aisle. No dramatic zooms. No narration. Just one continuous shot. Bride. Father-in-law. Then the 2 empty chairs. Then back to us. A moment lasting only a few seconds. A moment no one would ever forget. When we reached the altar, Robert turned toward me. Instead of immediately placing my hand into Mason's, he leaned closer. Only the 3 of us could hear him. I've spent 35 years running into burning buildings. He smiled. But today, this is the greatest honor of my life. Then he placed my hand into Mason's. Mason looked at him. Thank you. Robert simply nodded. No. He looked at both of us. Thank you. Then he quietly took his seat beside Linda. The officiant welcomed everyone. I barely remember his opening words. I remember Mason's face. The way he smiled before every sentence. The way his hands shook slightly when he unfolded his vows. He laughed softly. I rewrote these 6 times. The guests laughed with him. I kept trying to sound poetic. He looked at me. Turns out the truth is simpler. He took a slow breath. Claire, I can't promise we'll never argue. I can't promise life will always be easy. I can't promise we'll always know the right answer. He smiled again. But I can promise one thing. I will never make you wonder whether you're worth showing up for. I felt tears immediately. He continued. If you need me, I'm there. If you're celebrating, I'm there. If life falls apart, I'm there. And if we're lucky enough to grow old together, I'll still be there. Because love isn't measured by the speeches we make. It's measured by the places we're willing to stand. There wasn't a dry eye anywhere near the front rows. When it was my turn, I unfolded a single piece of paper. I'd written pages, then crossed most of them out. In the end, only a few sentences mattered. Mason, you taught me something I didn't know I was allowed to believe. I smiled through tears. That love doesn't have to be earned over and over. Sometimes, people simply choose you. I promise that every day for the rest of my life. I'll keep choosing you too. I folded the paper. I didn't need the rest anymore. Everything important had already been said. The officiant pronounced us husband and wife. The applause echoed across the vineyard. People laughed. People cried. Someone in the third row cheered loud enough to make everyone else laugh. Mason kissed me. For the first time that entire month, the empty chairs no longer felt like the center of the story. They were simply two empty chairs, surrounded by 128 people who had decided exactly where they wanted to be. And somehow, that made all the difference. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of California sunshine photographers dream about. Golden. Warm. Not a cloud in sight. I woke before my alarm. Not because I was nervous. Because my mind had finally accepted what my heart had been resisting for weeks. They weren't coming. There would be no last-minute apology. No frantic drive from the airport. No dramatic interruption halfway through the ceremony. Real life rarely works that way. Sometimes people simply make a choice. And keep making it. The bridal suite overlooked the vineyard. Rows of grapevines stretched across the hills, disappearing into the morning mist. Inside, music played softly while everyone moved with quiet purpose. My best friend, Olivia, steamed the final wrinkles from my dress. Linda arranged flowers on the windowsill because she insisted every room deserved fresh blooms. Aunt Grace unpacked pastries she'd baked before sunrise. The room smelled like coffee, lavender, and cinnamon. It felt peaceful, almost strangely so. Months earlier, I'd imagined this morning would be chaotic. Instead, everyone already knew exactly how to take care of one another. Adrian arrived just after 8. He barely spoke. He simply nodded hello before beginning to film the little details. The lace hanging from the dress. My wedding shoes by the window. Linda fastening a bracelet around my wrist. Grace quietly sewing one loose button back onto Mason's jacket after discovering it dangling by a thread. The moments no one usually remembers. The moments that become priceless years later. While Olivia curled the last strand of my hair, my phone vibrated. One new message. From Ethan. I hesitated before opening it. Hope today goes great. Singapore has been unbelievable. The launch exceeded every expectation. Wish you could have seen it. No mention of missing my wedding. No apology. No acknowledgement that our parents were standing beside him while I was reading his message in my wedding dress. Just another update about his success. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I quietly turned my phone completely off. Not silent. Off. Olivia noticed. Everything okay? I smiled. It is now. An hour later, Aunt Grace walked into the room holding her phone. Her expression looked different. Not angry. Not sad. Resolved. I almost didn't show you this. She sat beside me. But I think you deserve to know. She unlocked the screen and handed me the phone. It was a family group chat. 3 weeks old. Mom. Dad. Ethan. Grace. Uncle David. The first message came from Mom. Ethan's opening is officially scheduled for September 21. We'll need to fly to Singapore that week. A few minutes later, she added another message. Claire will understand. She always has. Dad replied 12 minutes later. She'll have Mason's parents there. Then Ethan reacted with a thumbs-up emoji. Nothing else. No hesitation. No. What about Claire? No. Can we make both work? No. Maybe I should tell them to stay. Just a thumbs up. As if they were discussing dinner reservations instead of my wedding. Further down the conversation, Uncle David wrote, Are you sure this is the right decision? Mom answered almost immediately. Claire doesn't need us the way Ethan does. She's always been independent. I read those words again. Then again. It wasn't a scheduling conflict. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't an unfortunate coincidence. It had been discussed, debated, considered, and then decided. My wedding hadn't been forgotten. It had simply lost. I handed the phone back. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Finally, Grace reached over and squeezed my hand. I'm sorry. I nodded. I know. Then something unexpected happened. I didn't cry. Not because I was holding it together. Because there were no tears left for people who had finally confirmed what I'd always suspected. There was only clarity. Linda stepped behind me. She fastened the final button on my dress. You ready? I looked into the mirror. For years, I'd imagined my mother's reflection standing behind me on this day. Instead, I saw Linda, adjusting my veil with careful hands, smiling proudly, exactly the way a mother should. And somehow, that felt enough. More than enough. There was a gentle knock at the door. Mason's voice floated through the hallway. Dad says he's been waiting outside for 20 minutes because he wanted to make absolutely sure he wasn't late. The whole room laughed. Linda rolled her eyes affectionately. He's been practicing that walk for a week. Grace laughed. I believe it. I picked up my bouquet. White garden roses. Eucalyptus. Soft blue thistles. Olivia had tied the ribbon herself. I took one last look around the room. Every single person there had chosen to spend this morning with me. Nobody had to be reminded. Nobody had been persuaded. Nobody had been guilted into showing up. They simply came. Because they wanted to. I opened the door. Robert was waiting in the hallway. Dark navy suit. Brand new tie. Shoes polished so carefully, I could almost see my reflection. The moment he looked up, his eyes filled with tears. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. Finally, he smiled. You look exactly like I hoped my daughter would look on her wedding day. I felt my throat tighten. You've never even had a daughter. He smiled wider. I do now. He offered me his arm. I slipped my hand through it. It felt steady. Strong. Safe. As we walked toward the ceremony doors, I realized something that hadn't occurred to me until that exact moment. The man beside me wasn't replacing my father. No one could. He was simply doing what my father had chosen not to do. And somehow, that made all the difference. The week before the wedding should have been filled with excitement. Instead, every time my phone buzzed, I braced myself for another relative trying to convince me that I was somehow responsible for fixing a decision I hadn't made. The first call came from my Uncle David. "Claire," he began carefully, "your mother's been under a lot of stress." I stared out the kitchen window. "So have I. You know how Ethan is. This restaurant is the biggest opportunity he's ever had. My wedding is the biggest day I've ever had. I know, sweetheart, but maybe you could postpone it." I almost laughed. "The venue is booked." "I know. The vendors are booked." "I know. 130 guests already made travel arrangements." "I know. So why are we even having this conversation?" He hesitated. "Because families make sacrifices." I closed my eyes. "I've been the only one making them." He didn't call again. The next morning, my father's sister sent me a 3-page email. She wrote about forgiveness, about honoring your parents, about how weddings were just one day, while family lasted forever. I read the entire message twice. Not once did she mention the fact that my parents were willingly missing that one day. Apparently, responsibility only traveled in one direction. I deleted the email without replying. That afternoon, Aunt Grace drove over with homemade peach cobbler. She set it on the kitchen counter and looked at me. "I heard your aunt's been preaching." I nodded. Grace rolled her eyes. "Funny how people always volunteer someone else's sacrifice." I smiled for the first time all day. She handed me a fork. "We're eating dessert before dinner." "That's your solution." "No." She took a bite. "But it's an excellent place to start." The rehearsal dinner took place in Robert and Linda's backyard. String lights stretched between old oak trees. Long wooden tables filled with homemade food. Neighbors wandered in carrying salads. Friends brought desserts without being asked. Someone's little daughter spent 20 minutes chasing butterflies instead of sitting with the adults. Nobody seemed bothered. It felt real. Not polished. Not expensive. Just warm. The kind of evening that couldn't be bought. Only built. Halfway through dinner, Robert stood up holding a glass of iced tea. The conversation slowly faded. "I've spent most of my life believing family was something you were born into." He smiled toward Mason. "Then my son introduced us to Claire. Several people looked my way." Robert continued. "I realized family isn't defined by who shares your last name. It's defined by who shows up." He looked directly at me. "Sometimes people drive across town because you matter." Aunt Grace. She smiled and lifted her glass. "Sometimes people spend hours helping decorate a wedding because your happiness matters." Linda reached over and squeezed my shoulder. "And sometimes—" Robert paused. "Someone trusts you enough to ask you to walk her down the aisle." His voice cracked. "I've faced burning buildings. I've carried strangers out of collapsed homes. I've seen courage in many forms. But nothing has ever humbled me more than being trusted with that responsibility." The backyard was completely silent. Even the children had stopped running. Robert raised his glass. "To Claire. May she never again wonder where she belongs." Everyone stood. Glasses lifted. I couldn't speak. I simply cried. Not the desperate tears I'd spent weeks hiding. These were different. These came from finally being surrounded by people who didn't need to be reminded to love me. Across the yard, Adrian quietly adjusted his camera. He wasn't searching for dramatic reactions. He wasn't chasing tears. He simply captured people being present. Robert smiling. Linda wiping her eyes. Grace reaching across the table to hold my hand. Mason looking at me with the same calm expression he always wore whenever life became difficult. Later, Adrian would tell me that was his favorite part of filmmaking. "The truth," he said. You never have to direct it. That night, lying in bed, I made one final mistake. I opened Instagram. Ethan had uploaded a story from Singapore. The skyline glittered behind him. Champagne glasses clinked. My parents stood beside him, smiling so widely they looked 20 years younger. The caption read, "Family showing up for family. Couldn't do this without them." I read the sentence over and over. Family showing up for family. I wondered if he'd typed it himself, or if my mother had suggested it. Either way, they believed it. They honestly believed they were demonstrating what family looked like. I locked my phone and placed it face down on the nightstand. Mason rolled over. "You okay?" I looked toward the ceiling. "I think tonight." I finally stopped waiting. He reached over and took my hand. Neither of us spoke again. Outside, the vineyards were quiet beneath the California stars. Tomorrow, I was getting married. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't hoping my parents would change their minds. I was simply hoping the people who had already chosen me would be exactly where they'd promised to be. 3 days later, my father finally called. He rarely phoned unless Mom asked him to. I could hear it in the hesitation before every sentence. "Claire, your mother said you've been upset." I laughed once. Not because anything was funny, because hearing the word upset felt almost insulting. "I'm getting married in 11 days. "I know. And you're not coming." Silence. Then a slow exhale. "Ethan has investors flying in from Europe. This launch could change his whole future." "What about mine?" Another silence. "We can't be in two places." "No," I said quietly. "You already decided where you wanted to be." He ignored that. "You'll have Mason's parents. They're wonderful people." There it was again. Someone else would fill the space they were leaving. Someone else would stand where they were supposed to stand. Someone else would celebrate what they chose to miss. "Claire, I'm done asking." Before he could answer, I ended the call. That evening, Mason found me sitting alone on the back deck. The California sunset painted the vineyards gold, but I barely noticed. He sat beside me without speaking. One thing I loved about him was that he never rushed to fix pain. He simply stayed with it. After a while, he asked, "What did your dad say?" "The same thing everyone always says." "And what's that?" "That I'll be okay." Mason nodded slowly. "You will be." I looked at him. "Not because they believe in me." He smiled. "No. Because you stopped needing their permission a long time ago." I wanted to argue. Instead, I realized he was right. The next morning, my younger brother texted me. "Hey sis, sorry about the timing. Once the restaurant settles down, we'll celebrate you properly. Promise." That was it. No question about seating. No excitement about the wedding. No apology for asking our parents to skip it. Just another promise for later. Later had become my family's favorite destination. Birthdays happened later. Celebrations happened later. Conversations happened later. Only Ethan's life ever happened right now. I didn't answer. 2 nights after that, Linda invited me over for dinner. She hadn't mentioned my parents once since hearing the news. Neither had Mason. Neither had his father. They simply kept showing up. Sometimes love sounds less like comforting words, and more like people refusing to disappear. After dinner, Mason went inside to help with dishes, leaving me alone on the back patio with his father. Robert Harper had spent 35 years as a firefighter before retiring. At 64, he still carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime walking toward emergencies while everyone else ran away. He poured fresh coffee into my mug. "You've been carrying something." I smiled weakly. I'm trying not to. He nodded. I know. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The evening breeze moved through the olive trees, surrounding the backyard. Somewhere down the hill, a dog barked twice. Finally, I looked at him. My dad isn't coming. I know. My mom either. I know. I swallowed hard. My brother gets both of them. Robert waited. Then I asked the question I'd practiced in my head all afternoon. Would you walk me down the aisle? He didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his coffee, then back at me. His eyes were already filling with tears. I've always hoped I'd have a daughter someday. His voice cracked. I just didn't know she'd find us herself. I started crying before he even finished the sentence. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I would be honored. At that exact moment, the sliding door opened. Linda had apparently been standing inside the kitchen, listening. She walked outside carrying a dish towel she clearly wasn't using for dishes anymore. Her cheeks were wet. Without saying anything, she wrapped both arms around me. No speeches. No advice. Just a hug that lasted long enough for me to stop trying not to cry. When she finally stepped back, she smiled. We're going to give you a beautiful wedding. For the first time in weeks. I believed someone. Robert bought a new tie the very next morning. Navy blue. Classic. Nothing flashy. Linda teased him for trying it on twice before breakfast. He insisted it had to be perfect. Not because anyone would notice. Because Claire deserved someone who cared enough to notice. Around the same time, one of Mason's closest college friends arrived from San Diego. His name was Adrian Brooks, an independent documentary filmmaker. Not famous. Not wealthy. Just deeply passionate about telling ordinary people's extraordinary stories. He'd built a respectable audience online by filming real families, local traditions, and community events across California. Nearly 70,000 subscribers. No sensationalism. No fake drama. Just honest storytelling. Months earlier, he'd asked whether he could document our wedding as part of a series called Moments That Matter. Real weddings. Real people. No scripts. No staged scenes. No manufactured emotion. We both agreed immediately. Adrian had one simple rule. If anyone asks me to stop filming, I stop. No questions. No arguments. Respect came first. Always. He spent the weeks before our wedding quietly capturing little moments. Linda teaching me her pie recipe. Robert helping Mason repair an old wooden arbor. Friends laughing while folding ceremony programs. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that suggested the story would become anything more than a heartfelt wedding film. None of us knew that sometimes the loudest moment in a documentary is complete silence. And in our story, that silence would be waiting in the front row. Mom left after about 40 minutes. She didn't ask for a hug. She didn't ask whether we could have dinner the following week. She didn't ask if everything could go back to the way it used to be. For the first time in my life, she walked away without asking me to make her feel better. I watched her drive down the road until the car disappeared around the bend. Only then did Mason step outside. He sat beside me on the porch. How did it go? I looked down at the reopened invitation resting in my lap. I think she finally met the daughter she never took the time to know. Life slowly became ordinary again. And I was grateful for that. Sunday dinners at Robert and Linda's house became our favorite tradition. Robert still insisted on making pancakes every weekend, even though he burned the first batch almost every single time. Linda laughed every single time anyway. Aunt Grace visited once a month with a different homemade dessert she claimed was experimental. Olivia eventually got engaged. When she asked who should walk her down the aisle if her father became too ill to travel, she smiled at Robert. He laughed. I suppose I'd better keep this navy tie. As for my parents, things changed slowly. Dad called every few weeks. Sometimes we talked for 10 minutes. Sometimes only 3. Neither of us forced conversations that weren't ready to happen. Mom stayed in therapy. Grace told me she rarely missed an appointment. Apparently, the first thing Mom told her therapist was, I spent 30 years confusing the child who complained less with the child who needed me less. That sentence stayed with me because it explained more than anything else ever had. Ethan reached out just before Christmas. His restaurant in Singapore had closed. The location had been beautiful. The business plan hadn't been. He didn't ask for sympathy. He simply said, I spent so much time believing everything had to revolve around me that I never noticed what it cost you. It was the first genuine apology I'd ever received from him. Not because his business had failed, because he'd finally looked backward instead of forward. I thanked him. That was enough for now. A year after the wedding, Adrian invited us to a small screening celebrating the anniversary of the documentary. The audience wasn't huge. Maybe 100 people. Afterward, someone raised their hand during the Q&A. They weren't interested in filmmaking. They weren't interested in weddings. They asked me one question. When you think back on your wedding now, what do you remember first? I smiled without needing to think. Not the empty chairs. The people sitting around them. Because that's the part time had strengthened. The absence faded. The presence remained. Today, the documentary has been watched by millions of people across the world. People still write to tell us that 2 empty chairs helped them understand something they'd been carrying for years. Sometimes they ask whether I regret letting Adrian publish it. My answer is always the same. No. The documentary didn't expose my family. It simply recorded a choice they had already made. Cameras don't create truth. They preserve it. Robert still keeps that navy tie in his closet. Every now and then, usually before family celebrations, he jokes that it's his lucky tie. I know the truth. It isn't lucky. It's a reminder that being a parent isn't about biology. It's about showing up. Again. And again. And again. Looking back now, I realize those 2 empty chairs weren't the most important part of our wedding. The most important part was everything surrounding them. The people who arrived early. The people who stayed late. The people who held my hand without being asked. The people who proved that love isn't measured by promises. It's measured by presence. And sometimes the family who changes your life is the one that chooses you. Before you go, I'd really like to hear your perspective. If you were in my position and, years later, your parents sincerely apologized and genuinely changed, but they had missed the one day you could never get back, would you rebuild the relationship completely, or would you keep loving them from a distance? What would it take for you to trust them again?